somebody who's joining us to talk about ROI for experience management. This workshop is going to be led by someone who's skilled in creating experience management business value and systematically changing organizations to align around experience and drive financial impact. She specializes in enabling brands with skills and competencies like design thinking, journey management, and value mapping. She believes sustainable change requires embedding customer experience capabilities into all parts of your organization. I'm sure you're nodding even as I introduce her. So we have with us right now founder, CEO, Experience Catalysts. Please welcome Miss Diane Majors. You know what we need to do? Huge round of applause, everybody. Welcome, Diane. Thank you very much for being here. And good morning to you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today from the other side of the world.
Well, I'm going to hand over the session to you, Diane, and I'm going to stop my pen and notebook and get ready to attend.
Awesome. Good. I'm going to throw a lot at everybody today. So good. Have that pen and pencil ready, or taking notes on your iPad or computer. Hello and welcome. I'm going to start presenting. Give me just a second to share my screen and we will get rolling. All right. All right. Please confirm that you all can see what I'm presenting. RJ, yes, good. All right, we are ready to go. I am so delighted to be able to share this with you today. One of the things that I know about experience management professionals is this ROI is vexing sometimes because we really try to tell a great story, and I'm going to give you some tools to tell the other side of the story. So there's much more to this than probably meets the eye, and I want to give you a definite process that you can follow to build this ROI story. I'm following up from Olga. If you attended earlier today, Olga also had information around experience management and ROI. I'm going to extend a little bit of what she talked about, and I'm going to give you also a case study that helps you really define not just which measures to take and how it can impact, but how you build this competency into your organization, how you make it part of your processes so it becomes operationalized. So just a little bit about me. I am, as I said, I'm founder and CEO for my own consultancy called Experience Catalysts, but I'm currently the chairman emeritus and past CEO for the Customer Experience Professionals Association. I was blessed to be able to have that position and be able to see and talk to many practitioners across the globe. And this allowed me to begin to see the challenges that people were having related to this particular competency. I came about this totally by accident. I started my career as a clinical psychologist and somewhere along that way got my MBA. But that was really driven by the fact that I worked for a very operational company, my first role, leading customer experience. And that taught me that I needed to talk about the financial business case of experience management because my executives were looking to me to tell that story. And while they believed that customer was great, the Net Promoter Score and the CSAT were indicators, but they weren't robust enough for them to continue investments. So I began to build this competency. So you can do this too. So don't lose hope. And if you've got a lot of things swimming around your head, I would say, in my opinion, this is one of the most important competencies you can build. So I'm going to help you out today and build off of what Olga talked about this morning. So if we think about what's happening with brands today, brands have this big strategy, right? This vision and mission of what they're trying to accomplish and how they position themselves in the marketplace. And when they express that, it's all about this, how those brand touch points impact the customer. This is what creates the value, whether it's the actual products and services or their tangible or intangible or even aspirational values. And that really comes to the engagement they have with customers. So I want you to think about this, how this all comes into play, because what we're going to do is talk about the expression and the engagement and how both of those things create value. So the other thing I want you to think about is creating value is not just creating value for the organization. We all know as consumers and as business people that those organizations that get us value, helping me achieve my goals, how I felt about it, how did they save me time, were the interactions quick and efficient and consistent and easy, all create value for the customer. And what we want to balance there is we also want to create value for the brand. So we want to know, like, how much do customers promote us, or what is our cost to serve, or how much did they spend? So what organizations need to understand is, how am I measuring both sides of this equation? How am I looking at not only what we want to know and what we're getting out of the relationship, but is it also valuable to the customer? Because we know if we create experience value for the customer, they will come back over and over again, which drives the value on the other side. So this is the ability to kind of tell the story between the two, both experience and client value. What we find is, if you think about everything that we do as a brand, what we do to influence the experience, whether it's changing something to digital or hiring different people for our care center, that really impacts human lives. It's the experience that they have, how we express that, and how the customer experiences the brand. And usually when you have an experience with an organization, it somehow changes your behavior. Either you go back to them more frequently, you refer them, you stop going to them. So what brands do drives how we feel, drives our behavior, and that's what drives business results. So when I talk about psychology, the reason that that's important is understanding what value you're creating and what those interactions drive as far as how customers feel is what really drives your financial impact. So if we think about everything we do by taking action, looking at that impact and looking at the outcome, we can begin to see that we have a cost to go do something and we have a benefit in the end, what we're after. And this is what we call the financial impact or return on investment. Your leaders are looking for, just like anybody else in the organization, for you to come to them with, here's what we're going to do, here's the results we're going to get, and I'd like for you to invest because there's going to be return on that investment. So I call this return on experience, because everybody kind of assumes, oh, if it's something customer experience, it's all about those metrics, the Net Promoter Score or CSAT. And what we know is that it's really about the financials. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So the first thing I also want to do is clarify terms. A lot of times when I hear practitioners talk about the terms they use, it's very confusing. So get it straight, because this is important as we think about how to calculate a business case. One is, there's really three things to consider. One is experience measures. These are things you can count. And I've given you examples at the bottom: calls to resolve, time to renew a contract, social media mentions that are positive or negative. Things you can count. Experience metrics are really about perception. Their Net Promoter Score, effort score, brand index, trust index, anything that's a score index is a reflection of perception. And then this last one is the experience value. So this is actually the financial impact, the cost to serve. Olga talked about some of this today, but I want to make sure you're clear, because what I see happening a lot of times is organizations look at the metrics and they correlate it to the value, when in fact, what we need to be looking at is those measures and how we're moving them to define direct impact to the experience value, the ROI. How many times are we reducing calls to the care center, which is reducing the cost to serve? Versus Net Promoter Score goes up 2 or 3 points, we can then correlate that to, we're going to have increased revenue. Nobody's going to argue with the correlation, but what I want you to be thinking about is, how do you measure the correlation from your metric with actual financial measures and ROI in business value terms? That's what we're here to talk about today. How do we do that? So let's continue to go forward and think about that correlation versus causation, because this is what we typically see, where we're so focused on that correlation. Nobody's going to argue with it. But what I want you to be thinking about is, how do we look at this causation? We changed something that drove how somebody felt, drove their behavior, which drove the business results. I went to a restaurant, I had a great meal, I therefore go back to that restaurant and I refer them to others, which means more lifetime value for the restaurant and reduced cost of acquisition for new people coming in. So that's an example of how those things differ. Here's an example of that. If I think about this Net Promoter Score, and this is an example of an organization that took a brand from -29 Net Promoter Score to 70 after a couple of years of working through all of these things you see and getting this boost in Net Promoter Score. When they got to 70, the executive said, "Oh, well, we're at 70. I think we're done." Well, what they didn't realize, that we've got this great score and we're kind of up there with all of the people who do really good work. Well, what they didn't realize is that they had great Net Promoter Scores and they had made some impact on it, but they were leaking revenue. They had done so many things and invested so much that by the time they were able to look at it, they really had not recouped their cost. So one of the things we need to do, again, is balance that, because if you look at where they weren't really thinking about the actual financial impact of what they were doing, both positive and negative, they were missing the other side of the financial story and the impact story. So that's what I consider value and business outcome. So I want to take you through the story, and I want to set the stage for this process that a peer of mine, Greg Tucker, and I have developed. And we have a course coming up on this that you can take and go practice. But I want to give you just a high level of what is this process and how does it work, and can you show me an example? So that's what we're going to do right now. The first is really to have a strategy. So the things that I talked about were, how are you going to actually think about and track your value? You got to have a plan. That's the first piece. The second is you need to be including experience mapping when you do your journey discovery or your journey mapping. You need to include finances and the financial impact to the customer and the brand in that mapping session. I often see journey maps and there is no mention at all of where there are opportunities or what even you're going to measure as it relates to the journey. Then we really have to design for that value. We want to create those experiences that are going to drive those numbers in a different way, the financial value numbers. Then we really have to look at, did we actually create the value that we wanted to? How are we designing the experience so that it maximizes value for both the customer and the organization? Then we need to go back and tell the story. So I also see a lot of experienced professionals do a project and they launch it and then they're on to the next thing. And what they don't do is go back and tell the story. So I'm going to share a little bit of how to do that. And then we talk about this value optimization, which is not only going back and looking at, hey, what benefits did we get, but what is next as it relates to that particular touch point? How can I then multiply that? How can I drive more referrals and really boost that number of people who are advocating for me to reduce my cost to serve, increase my acquisition, reduce the cost of acquisition, all of those things that we know are impactful. Okay, so this is the process we're going to walk through today in our example. So I'm going to give you a case study of a nonprofit that we worked with that was building and trying to understand the value they were creating for their donors and the value they were creating for this nonprofit, which you can imagine, they don't have a lot of money. They are a nonprofit. So every single dime that they spent either went toward their administrative costs or went back into what they were doing to donate and support children from across the globe. So we're going to talk a little bit about a couple things. We're going to talk about internally their volunteers and their donors, and externally those people who are contributing to their cause, as well as internal employees and internal operations. How are they looking at the value that they were creating? And this is another part that I see typically missing from the value equation is, what are you doing in the organization that you can also measure as part of the value? So in this organization, this nonprofit was helping children worldwide in more than 90 countries, and they had donations of over 2.1 billion, so not a small nonprofit. They provide humanitarian aid, development, and advocacy, and they focus a lot on child adoption, livestock, and building schools and promoting water fountains and water wells for villages in poor countries. So that's kind of a little bit of a profile of this nonprofit, so you know who they are. So what their goal was is they wanted to reinvent the value journey for donors. They began to realize in their feedback that the donors were not seeing the value outside of them contributing. They didn't really understand the value proposition, that expression of the brand and how they were engaged with the brand. And so that was where they wanted to change and reinvent that value journey. So they had some targeted outcomes. They thought about what is it going to take. They did a lot of investigation and looked at information that they had, and they created this end-to-end blueprint of the journey. So this is journey mapping as the beginning for discovery. They looked at each touch point to evaluate the current experiences, align those to their values and a future state. So they looked at, well, this is what's happening today, but what do we want to have happen that's going to drive engagement? They identified the moments of truth, and then to use those to conduct a deeper design. So I see a lot of times too, organizations who do their journey mapping, it's very high level, but they don't really dig into that value proposition for the customer. They're focused on kind of finding and fixing. They then looked at the business changes they needed to support the future journey. Was that data? Was it changes in roles? Was it better governance, communications? What was it that was going to make the business change that was going to impact the experience? And then they began to structure this value creation and measurement framework. So they added that as part of their routine, if you will, and their process in the organization to look at this concept of value creation and have those measures in place so that they can say, what are those financial levers we're going to pull as we go through designing this new experience? We also use the Bain and Company model. Now you can go and look at this for there's B2C model, a business to consumer, but there's also a B2B model. And what it looks like is the Maslow's hierarchy, if you're familiar with that, where we're talking about very functional things we're doing, but we're also talking about more aspirational, life-changing social impact opportunities. All of these things have value for the consumer. We all know that in our lives, it's not sometimes the functional things, although a lot of times it is, but it's also where are you reducing my anxiety and where do I feel like I'm contributing back? Where do I feel like I belong with a brand or an organization? So we use this to identify in those circles, what do we think we're going to impact from a value perspective for the customer or donor in this example. So it required a deeper understanding of the donors and the range of value that they were getting. The social impact, a sense of community, connection, simplify, they were contributing to the world issues. And so we stepped back and said, we really need to identify both those functional things, but also these emotional levers we're pulling, because we know if we hit on those, we're also going to see results. So we then stepped back and did an ecosystem mapping approach. And an ecosystem map is simply a much broader map of what's happening with the organization. It includes partners and suppliers and other nonprofits and a richer, more extensive journey map. And we began to design and think about personalization. We integrated value through all the interactions we were redesigning, and we looked at technology enablers as well, because we knew that there was opportunity there to bring tech to the table. We also thought about all the different teams. So if you think about all the different teams in an organization within the business, we looked at each of these parts of the organization and thought about and engaged them to really understand what they were trying to accomplish. So what this did for us was it began to highlight for us if, for example, the finance or let's say HR was looking for cost of acquisition of new talent or retention, we needed to make sure that as we design things, we kept that in our minds. How could we get better experience to the customer, but also get better results for all the different parts of the organization? We also looked at donor profiles. So obviously not all customers are created equal in this space of an audience of one, we call it. There are many different types of donors. So we looked at the donors that had the most potential and began to select this profile who we'll call the committed yet passive. These are people who donate, but don't really want to have a lot of interaction with the organization, but still want value. And so you see here, this is a profile or a persona. So we selected who we were going to be doing this with, because we discovered that through that persona work, that the value creation was different for each of the personas. So there's another tick to write down is that, thinking about your persona, what are those value levers that are important to them? Because that is what's going to help you really move the needle when it comes to value for the organization. So we did this experience journey discovery, and we talked about the purpose, we talked about the platform, we talked about priorities, but we also brought into that session the customer value. How and where and when do they define value? We also talked about the goals of the organization. What's the benefit that it's bringing for the business? How does it relate to our strategic goals? So embedding that in what you're doing, in your process of how you're exploring and how you're designing new experiences. So this holistic design of the experience, just to give you a visual of it, is you think about the journey of the customer, but you also think about all the different touch points, whether it's digital or in person. But you're also looking outside of that to say, what else is going on in the consumer's life? How many other organizations are coming to them for money? And why are they choosing one over the other? So it's a much richer approach, but it also allows you to look at internal capabilities and workflows and processes and the culture and what's impacting that experience. And then we talked about technology layers and data, which is so important today, but we wanted to make sure we started with the experience and the internal workings of the organization before we even talked about technology. So I see this a lot with people who are going through a digital transformation. They start with the technology and think about the customer later. So we reverse that in these instances. We then used experience design. So what's important about this, that as we really began to bring the organization along, we built in design techniques, but we also built in those design techniques, we built in return on investment. So a great example of that is when you think about journey mapping, do you have a swim lane, a row in that journey map that talks about value to the organization and the customer? It's an example of how to embed it. So we had a high-level master journey, right? We had all the kind of standard things that happen. Now this is a very, very simple map, obviously just to communicate what was happening in the stages they went through. We began the design sessions with cross-functional teams. So if you remember when we talked about the different people that were involved and what they were after, by having this cross-functional team in the room, we were also able to begin to hear the goals that they were after and things that they knew they could impact, that would impact the customer value, but also would impact the organization. So we had them in the room thinking about what are the measures and metrics and business value that were important for them as we began to define the future state. So we obviously did a much more robust map. Now this is a very simple version again, but what you'll see here is that there is actually a row for this financial impact to the brand, the value to the donor, and tangible and intangible value. So we went through a process during that session of really bringing those in as part of our mapping exercises. So we then looked at, well, what are some of the internal levers? So this model here is a very simple model that you can totally leverage, talking about if we're trying to create a project around improving the experience. We have targets like typically, improve their experience and improve employees and increase donor engagement, optimize our resources. Pretty high level targets for what we were doing. And what we realized is that in developing this process is that obviously the executives were talking about return on investment. So here we've got these high level targets and we've got the executives talking about revenue and cost. How are we going to bridge that gap? So in the middle is where we really started to create what are the things we need to identify as we change this that are going to link to increased revenue and cost. So we talked about programs that we put in place. So fast forward a little bit, we came up with a lot of solutions around a new experience for this particular donor segment. We looked at business rules. We personalized their impact story. We increased the personalization. We gave them more communications around their story. Internally, we communicated better. We aligned across the channels. We looked at technology and how to improve that. So all of those activities that we did, all the things that we began to identify as part of this solution and part of the future state, we began to assign impacts to those. So things like you see here in this top box under the business levers that track to revenue, we have increased marketing effectiveness, increasing prospective donors, expanding referrals, which all led to increased donations, which means revenue. If we think about the cost factor, we were able to reduce marketing costs because people were advocating more. We improved workflows, which meant more productivity. And we integrated data sources, which made the data integration, the cost to maintain that data and use that data improved, which was also a cost reduction. So you can see we went from talking about the experience to talking about ROI, return on investment, which is what am I going to give you in order to get back? And how is that going to increase revenue and reduce cost? Okay, so the value of design then for us was, if you think about the way that this happens, if you think about all the things you do, we brought design into play because we wanted to really make sure that we use tools and techniques that would help us discover what was going to happen. So I also see this as being another process you put in place, because many organizations find a problem and they just go fix it. They don't really understand the problem enough. They don't use design to really dig into the problem and the opportunity and find the right problem to solve. And they certainly don't take the time to look at all the different things that they could do and how they contribute to the ROI of a particular project. So that's what I encourage you and challenge you to do after your sessions today. So let's kind of wrap this up a little bit about, well, okay, that's great. We have all of those things, but you talked about benefits realization. That's a fancy term for go tell your story. Look at the value, think about what you're doing and how you're going to share that impact. You need process and governance to make sure that everything's being tracked. You need to create baselines for the business case. You need to track those benefits. You need to discover if there's what we call emergent benefits. What happened as a result of this that you didn't plan for? There's probably a lot of other benefits that are more intangible, but can be linked to tangible. And then give these insights to the intangible benefits. You know, what happened and what did we learn from it? And what can we do differently next time? And then really having a plan to share those benefit stories. Tell your story. Tell what you impacted and how you impacted, and talk in the language of your executives. Talk about ROI, talk about the investment, talk about cost and revenue, because that's what they talk about. So you can see that we had significant opportunity with this customer and the value creation for the brand and the donors. So when we looked at all of this, how we built out the new experience, what we created as far as value for both of them, and how we really brought that to life. And how we applied all these concepts to what we were doing. So you can see now, as I walked through that story, how this really came to life. But I want to also encourage you, I talked a lot about the financial impact and ROI and the tactics of how to do it. I want you to focus on the stories, but add the calculations into it. The numbers give you credibility, but the stories really move people to action. So while I focused a lot on the ROI, don't lose sight of the fact that you are improving human lives. The reason I use this nonprofit is because it is one of the, as we find out our new purposes and people are becoming more about sustainability and purpose, we need to still be able to tell the story. So I chose that story on purpose so that you'd have a good example of how even a nonprofit was able to build this muscle in what they were doing. So delivering experience-driven value, we have a lot of potential that isn't being realized, and it requires discipline and rigor around the approach. You need to enable the change of how the organization talks about experience and how they talk about ROI, but also what tools do they use? How do they structure this work around finding value? And then what approaches do you have, from tools to methods to formats to the roles people play, that we can use in defining, designing, and delivering the value that we're after. So I'll open it up for questions now, and I'll take myself out of slideshow. Give me just a second. Okay. Do we have any questions for discussion?
We're just looking at that, Diane, and I think each one of our audience members is actually, the participants are all, I think there's a lot going on internally. We're accepting so much information that right now we don't really have too much of space to mull over and come up with the questions, but your contact details are here, and I'm sure that one can reach out to you for sure. So while you're writing down your notes, go ahead and write down Diane's email address, which is on your screen as we speak. So thank you.
Happy to answer any questions. Please feel free to reach out. That was a lot of information, but I think what you'll find is if you just think about the process you're using and how you're telling the story, our stories need to change as CX professionals.
Looking at, okay, well, and that is exactly what I was thinking about. I was thinking about the storyteller in you, keeping us glued in for the last 40-45 minutes, connecting with each one of you, with each one of us. And then you have this title on the page that says keep the stories human, and then you move into that, talking about the stories and the calculations. So Diane, you've given us so much to kind of jot down and mull over
Sure.
and think about. But I'm pretty sure your cup of coffee kind of gave you all this energy that you reached out to
It
each
did.
one of us.
It did. It did.
So
All right.
thank you very
You're
much.
welcome.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
But before you go, we've got a small ritual going, and
Yes.
so it's just a chant in keeping with our experience here, the event. So when I say customer, you say fest. Are you good?
Okay. Yes.
Okay, customer,
Fest.
customer.
Fest.
All right, we've got it. Picked up the energy there just a little, and we've got to move into our next segment, Diane. But
All
thank
right. All right. You're welcome. Have a great day.
you too. You too.